In the spring of 2006, Italian football stood at its proudest moment. The national team was preparing for a World Cup campaign that would end in glory. Beneath that glory, Italian prosecutors had already begun examining thousands of intercepted telephone calls. The conversations would shake the foundations of Serie A. Neapolitan prosecutors investigating alleged irregular payments had stumbled onto something far larger. Wiretaps captured conversations between football officials and referee designators. The scandal would become known as Calciopoli, a word combining calcio, Italian for football, with the suffix suggesting a city of corruption. The name stuck immediately. What began as whispers in prosecutors' offices became a roar that stripped champions of titles and sent historic clubs tumbling into lower divisions. Nothing would be the same. Juventus, the most decorated club in Italian football history, was stripped of their 2004-05 and 2005-06 Serie A titles by the Italian Football Federation Sporting Tribunal. The Sporting Tribunal ruled in July 2006 that Juventus would be relegated to Serie B for the 2006-07 season. It was an unprecedented punishment for the Turin Giants. AC Milan, Fiorentina, and Lazio also received points deductions and other penalties. The Italian football landscape was redrawn overnight by the tribunal's rulings. AC Milan were initially relegated to Serie B but successfully appealed. Their penalty was reduced to a points deduction at the start of the 2006-07 Serie A season. Fiorentina were relegated to Serie B and given a points deduction. The Florentine club faced a painful rebuilding process after the tribunal's verdict was handed down. Lazio also received a points deduction. The Roman club's involvement in the scandal added another layer of shock to Italian football's most turbulent summer in decades. Luciano Moggi, Juventus's former general director, was at the center of the Sporting Tribunal's findings. He was banned from all football-related activities by the federation. Antonio Giraudo, Juventus's former chief executive, also received a ban from football activities. The tribunal's rulings targeted individuals as well as clubs. The Italian Football Federation's federal prosecutor Stefano Palazzi presented the case against the clubs and officials. The proceedings were conducted under sporting law, not criminal law. Moggi denied wrongdoing throughout the proceedings. His legal team contested the interpretation of the wiretapped conversations presented as evidence by the prosecution. The wiretaps revealed extensive telephone contact between Moggi and figures connected to the referee designation system. The content of those calls formed the core of the case. Referee designation in Italian football at the time was managed by the Associazione Italiana Arbitri, the Italian Referees Association. Its officials featured prominently in the wiretaps. The scandal raised fundamental questions about whether the referee designation process had been influenced by club officials. The tribunal found that it had been in certain cases. Juventus's relegation to Serie B was the most dramatic sporting punishment in the club's history. Players and staff faced an uncertain future as the verdict sank in. Several Juventus players exercised release clauses in their contracts following the relegation ruling. The club lost key members of its squad in the weeks after the verdict. Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Fabio Cannavaro, Patrick Vieira, and Lilian Thuram were among the players who departed Juventus following the relegation. The squad was dramatically reshaped. Despite relegation, Juventus retained a core of loyal players who chose to remain with the club for the Serie B campaign. Their commitment was widely noted at the time. Alessandro Del Piero, Gianluigi Buffon, and Pavel Nedved were among those who stayed at Juventus through the Serie B season. Their loyalty became part of the club's narrative. Juventus won the Serie B title in 2006-07 and returned to Serie A at the first attempt. The club's recovery was swift, but the reputational damage lingered for years. The 2005-06 Serie A title was awarded to Internazionale, who had not been implicated in the scandal. Inter received the championship without having played for it in a playoff. The decision to award the title to Internazionale was itself controversial. Some argued the championship should have been left vacant rather than reassigned to another club. The 2004-05 Serie A title was also stripped from Juventus. That season's championship was declared void rather than awarded to another club by the Sporting Tribunal. Italian football's reputation suffered internationally. The scandal broke just as the Azzurri were competing at the 2006 World Cup in Germany, creating a surreal backdrop. Italy won the 2006 World Cup, defeating France on penalties in the final in Berlin. The national triumph provided a complicated counterpoint to the domestic scandal unfolding at home. Several players involved in the Calciopoli clubs were part of Italy's World Cup winning squad. The intersection of triumph and scandal created an extraordinary moment in Italian sport. The Sporting Tribunal's first instance rulings were handed down in July 2006. Appeals followed almost immediately, with clubs and individuals challenging the severity of the penalties. The appeals process resulted in some penalties being reduced. AC Milan's relegation was overturned on appeal, replaced by a points deduction at the start of the new season. Fiorentina's relegation was upheld on appeal, though their points deduction was adjusted. The club began the 2006-07 Serie A B season under significant financial and sporting pressure. Lazio's points deduction was also confirmed through the appeals process. The Roman club faced the new season in Serie A but with a significant handicap from the outset. The full consequences of Calciopoli would take years to fully emerge. Legal challenges, criminal proceedings, and historical disputes continued long after the sporting verdicts were delivered. To understand how the scandal emerged, it is necessary to examine the structure of Italian football's referee designation system as it existed in the early 2000s. The designatory arbitrali, the referee designators, were responsible for assigning referees to Serie A matches each week. This role placed them at the intersection of power and influence. Paolo Bergamo and Pierluigi Piretto were the two senior referee designators whose telephone conversations with club officials featured in the wiretap evidence presented to the tribunal. The wiretaps captured conversations in which Moggi and the designators discussed referees and matches. The tribunal found these conversations constituted improper influence on the designation process. Bergamo and Piretto both received bans from football activities as a result of the tribunal's findings. Their roles in the designation system were central to the prosecution's case. The prosecution alleged that Moggi used his telephone network to seek favorable referee assignments for Juventus matches. The tribunal accepted elements of this allegation in its ruling. Moggi's defense argued that the telephone conversations were misinterpreted and that contact between club officials and football federation figures was common practice in Italian football. The question of whether other clubs also engaged in similar contact with referee designators became a significant and contested aspect of the scandal's legacy. International's position in the scandal was disputed. Some parties alleged that wiretap evidence involving inter-officials had not been fully investigated by the original prosecution. Juventus and their supporters consistently argued that the investigation was selective and that Inter had not faced equivalent scrutiny. These claims were disputed by the federation and prosecutors. The Neapolitan prosecutors who originally intercepted the calls had been investigating a separate matter. The football-related conversations were discovered incidentally during that investigation. The wiretap transcripts were passed to the Italian Football Federation, which then launched its own sporting investigation. The two processes, criminal and sporting, ran on separate tracks. The sporting investigation moved quickly. The Italian Football Federation's federal prosecutor assembled the case and brought charges against clubs and individuals within weeks of receiving the evidence. The speed of the sporting proceedings was itself a subject of debate. Some defendants argued they had insufficient time to prepare an adequate defense against the charges brought. The tribunal's hearings took place in an atmosphere of intense public and media scrutiny. Italian newspapers and television covered every development as the verdicts approached in July 2006. Luciano Moggi had been one of the most powerful figures in Italian football for over a decade before Calciopoli. His influence at Juventus extended well beyond the club's borders. Moggi had previously worked at Napoli and Torino before joining Juventus in 1994. Under his tenure, Juventus won multiple Serie A titles and reached European finals. The wiretap evidence showed Moggi making and receiving a very large number of telephone calls to and from football officials, agents, and media figures during the period under investigation. The tribunal found that Moggi had engaged in conduct designed to influence the referee designation process in a manner that violated Italian Football Federation regulations. Moggi was banned from all football-related activities by the Italian Football Federation. The ban was one of the most severe individual penalties handed down in the proceedings. Moggi subsequently pursued legal challenges through the Italian courts. The criminal proceedings against him took years to work through the Italian judicial system. In 2015, an Italian criminal court acquitted Moggi of sporting fraud charges. The criminal acquittal did not overturn the sporting tribunal's earlier rulings, which operated under different standards. The distinction between criminal acquittal and sporting tribunal findings was a crucial legal point in the ongoing disputes about Calciopoli's legacy and the fairness of the penalties imposed. Antonio Giraudo, Juventus's former chief executive, also received a lengthy ban from football activities. He too pursued legal challenges through the Italian courts in subsequent years. The Italian Football Federation's president at the time of the scandal was Franco Carraro. He resigned from his position in the wake of the Calciopoli revelations. Guido Rossi was appointed as the new Italian Football Federation president following Carraro's resignation. Rossi oversaw the initial stages of the sporting investigation and prosecution. Rossi's own connections to International, where he had previously served as president, were cited by Juventus and their supporters as evidence of a conflict of interest in the proceedings. The allegation of conflict of interest regarding Rossi was one of the most persistent criticisms of the Calciopoli proceedings. The federation disputed that any impropriety had occurred. International's position throughout the scandal was that the club had not engaged in improper conduct and that the investigation had been conducted fairly and thoroughly. In 2010, further wiretap transcripts emerged that some parties claimed showed conversations involving international officials had not been fully examined in the original investigation. These additional transcripts reignited the debate about whether the Calciopoli investigation had been comprehensive and impartial. Juventus formally requested a review of the original proceedings. The Italian Football Federation declined to reopen the Calciopoli case on the basis of the additional transcripts. The original sporting verdicts remained in place. Juventus pursued their grievances through the Italian courts. In 2011, a Naples court ruled that the original wiretap investigation had been conducted lawfully. The legal and sporting disputes surrounding Calciopoli continued to generate controversy in Italy for many years after the original verdicts. The debate showed no sign of resolution. AC Milan's involvement in the scandal centered on conversations involving club officials and referee designators. The tribunal found violations of federation regulations had occurred. Milan's initial relegation to Serie B was overturned on appeal. The appeals panel reduced the penalty to a points deduction of 8 points at the start of the 2006-07 season. Despite starting the 2006-07 Serie A season with a points deduction, AC Milan went on to win the UEFA Champions League that season, defeating Liverpool in the final in Athens. Milan's Champions League triumph in 2007 added another layer of complexity to the Calciopoli narrative. The club had been penalized yet still achieved European football's highest honor. Fiorentina's relegation to Serie B was a severe blow to the Florentine club. They had been building momentum in Serie A and had qualified for European competition before the scandal. Fiorentina returned to Serie A after one season in Serie B. The club's recovery was aided by strong local support and the loyalty of key players who remained through the difficult period. Lazio's points deduction affected their Serie A campaign in 2006-07. The Roman club faced the season at a disadvantage but avoided further relegation despite the penalty. The referee designators Bergamo and Piretto were banned from football activities by the Italian Football Federation. Their careers in football administration were effectively ended. Several referees who had officiated in Serie A during the period under investigation were also examined as part of the proceedings. Some faced their own disciplinary processes. The Italian Referees Association underwent significant reform in the aftermath of Calciopoli. The designation system was restructured to reduce the potential for outside influence. The reforms to the referee designation system were intended to increase transparency and reduce the opportunities for club officials to exert influence over referee appointments. The Italian Football Federation also introduced new regulations governing contact between club officials and Football Federation figures. The aim was to prevent a recurrence of the conduct identified. Serie A's reputation internationally was damaged by the scandal. European clubs and governing bodies watched the proceedings with concern about the integrity of Italian football. UEFA monitored the Italian Football Federation's handling of the scandal. The European governing body expressed confidence in the federation's ability to manage the proceedings appropriately. The financial consequences for the relegated clubs were severe. Relegation to Serie B meant significantly reduced television revenues and the loss of major commercial partnerships. Juventus's Serie B season in 2006-07 attracted significant attention. Despite playing in the second division, the club maintained large attendances and strong commercial interest. Juventus won the Serie B championship in 2006-07 with a significant points margin. The club's dominance of the second division underlined the scale of their resources relative to rivals. The club's return to Serie A in 2007-08 was accompanied by significant investment in new players. Juventus sought to rebuild their squad and restore their position at the top of Italian football. The criminal proceedings related to Calciopoli moved through the Italian judicial system at a much slower pace than the sporting tribunal process. Multiple trials and appeals followed. Moggi faced criminal charges of sporting fraud in the Italian courts. The proceedings were lengthy and involved multiple hearings over several years before reaching a conclusion. In 2015, the Naples Court of Appeal acquitted Moggi of the sporting fraud charges. The court found that the criminal standard of proof had not been met in his case. The criminal acquittal did not restore Moggi's standing in football. The Italian Football Federation sporting ban remained in effect, as sporting and criminal proceedings operate independently. Moggi continued to maintain his innocence publicly after the criminal acquittal. He argued that the sporting tribunal's findings had been unjust and based on misinterpreted evidence. The question of whether Juventus's titles should be restored became a recurring debate in Italian football. The club and their supporters consistently argued the case for reinstatement. The Italian Football Federation consistently declined to restore the stripped titles to Juventus. The sporting verdicts of 2006 remained the official record of Italian football history. Juventus's official history on the club's website and in their stadium continued to reference the disputed seasons. The club's own record-keeping reflected their contested view of events. The Calciopoli scandal had a lasting effect on Italian football's standing in European competition. Serie A clubs faced increased scrutiny from UEFA and potential sponsors in the years that followed. Italian football's television rights values were affected in the years following Calciopoli. The scandal contributed to a broader period of financial and competitive difficulty for Serie A. The rise of the Premier League and La Liga as dominant European competitions during this period coincided with Serie A's difficulties. Calciopoli was one factor among several in Italian football's decline. Juventus's absence from the Champions League during their Serie B season meant they missed a year of European competition and the associated revenues and prestige. The club's return to Champions League competition in 2008-09 marked a significant step in their rehabilitation. Juventus gradually rebuilt their European standing over the following seasons. Juventus's subsequent dominance of Serie A, winning 9 consecutive league titles between 2012 and 2020, was seen by some as evidence of the club's enduring strength despite Calciopoli. Critics argued that Juventus's later dominance raised questions about competitive balance in Italian football. Supporters of the club pointed to it as proof of their legitimate excellence. The Calciopoli scandal prompted broader discussions about governance in Italian football. Calls for greater transparency in federation decision-making grew louder in the years that followed. The Italian Football Federation implemented a series of governance reforms in the years after Calciopoli. These included changes to the referee designation process and federation oversight structures. The role of football agents in the Calciopoli wiretaps was also noted by investigators. The conversations revealed the extensive networks through which information and influence flowed in Italian football. The media's role in the Calciopoli story was significant. Italian newspapers and television programs published and broadcast extensive coverage of the wiretap transcripts as they became public. The publication of wiretap transcripts in the Italian media created a public atmosphere of outrage and debate. Fans of all clubs followed the development with intense interest. Some Italian journalists who covered Calciopoli extensively noted that the scandal had exposed the informal networks of influence that had long existed in Italian football administration. The Italian parliament also took an interest in the Calciopoli scandal. Parliamentary questions were raised about the governance of Italian football and the role of the federation. The government's interest in the scandal reflected the broader cultural significance of football in Italy. Serie A was not merely a sporting competition but a major national institution. The Calciopoli scandal was compared by some commentators to earlier Italian football controversies, including the Toto Nero betting scandal of 1980, which had also resulted in relegations and bans. The Toto Nero scandal of 1980 had seen AC Milan and Lazio relegated and several players banned. The parallels with Calciopoli were noted by Italian football historians and commentators. The recurring nature of major scandals in Italian football prompted questions about structural issues within the sport's governance. Calciopoli was seen by some as a symptom of deeper problems. The Italian Football Federation's handling of Calciopoli was reviewed by independent observers. Some praised the speed and decisiveness of the sporting tribunal's response. Others criticized the proceedings as rushed and potentially unfair to defendants who had limited time to prepare their cases. The debate about procedural fairness persisted for years. The appeals process that followed the initial verdicts resulted in some modifications to the penalties. The appeals panel demonstrated a degree of independence from the first instance tribunal. The final penalties confirmed through the appeals process were Juventus relegated to Serie B with a points deduction, AC Milan, Fiorentina, and Lazio given points deductions in Serie A or B. Individual bans confirmed through the process included those of Moggi, Giraudo, Bergamo, and Piretto. The penalties effectively ended their careers in football administration. The 2006-07 Serie A season began with the shadow of Calciopoli hanging over Italian football. AC Milan started with -8 points, Fiorentina and Lazio in Serie B and Serie A respectively. International, unpenalized, began the 2006-07 season in a strong position. They went on to win the Serie A title that season, their second consecutive championship under Roberto Mancini. The legacy of Calciopoli remains deeply contested in Italian football. Juventus supporters and the club itself have never fully accepted the legitimacy of the sporting tribunal's findings. The stripped titles of 2004-05 and 2005-06 remain officially unawarded or awarded to other clubs in Italian football's historical record. The debate about their legitimacy continues. Moggi's criminal acquittal in 2015 was cited by Juventus supporters as vindication of their position. The sporting tribunal's findings, however, were not subject to the same review. The Italian Football Federation maintained that the sporting and criminal processes were separate and that the sporting verdicts remained valid regardless of the criminal court's conclusions. The question of whether the Calciopoli investigation was comprehensive and impartial remains unresolved. Allegations that some evidence was not fully examined have never been definitively settled. Italian football's broader governance challenges continued after Calciopoli. The sport faced further controversies in subsequent years, though none reached the scale of the 2006 scandal. The Calciopoli scandal accelerated discussions about the need for independent oversight of football governance in Italy. Reform advocates pointed to the scandal as evidence of systemic vulnerability. For the clubs involved, Calciopoli left financial and reputational scars that took years to heal. The cost of relegation, player departures, and legal proceedings was substantial. For Italian football fans, Calciopoli represented a moment of profound disillusionment. The sport they loved had been shown to have serious vulnerabilities in its governance structures. The players who competed during the Calciopoli era faced their own complicated legacy. Some had won titles that were subsequently stripped, others had competed in a system later found to be flawed. Gianluigi Buffon, who stayed at Juventus through the Serie B season, later spoke publicly about the experience. His loyalty to the club during that period became part of his personal legend. Alessandro Del Piero's decision to remain at Juventus through Serie B was similarly celebrated by the club's supporters. His commitment was seen as a defining act of loyalty. The Calciopoli scandal prompted academic and journalistic study of Italian football governance. Books, documentaries, and academic papers examined the events and their causes in detail. International observers used Calciopoli as a case study in sports governance failure. The scandal was cited in discussions about the need for independent oversight of football federations worldwide. The scandal's name, Calciopoli, entered the Italian language as a shorthand for corruption in football. It joined a list of Italian political scandals that had acquired similar compound names. Juventus's 9 consecutive Serie A titles from 2012 to 2020 were achieved under a new ownership and management structure. The club had rebuilt comprehensively in the years after Calciopoli. The debate about Calciopoli's fairness and completeness has never been fully resolved. It remains one of the most contested episodes in the history of European club football. What the documented evidence established was that conversations between club officials and referee designators took place and that the sporting tribunal found these violated federation regulations. What remained disputed was whether the investigation was comprehensive, whether all relevant evidence was examined, and whether the penalties were proportionate to the conduct established. Calciopoli stands as a defining moment in Italian football history, a scandal that exposed real vulnerabilities, delivered severe consequences, and left questions that Italian football has never fully answered.